We are a group of friends who share the same passion and who are driven by one single aim. We wish to preserve that wealth of different and yet related values that is known as the Mille Miglia. With these words, Giuseppe Lucchini inaugurated the rebirth of the Mille Miglia. In the small town of Sirmione on the shores of Lake Garda in northern Italy, a group of American vintage automobile enthusiasts have come together to join others from Italy and around the world to participate in the 1984 Mille Miglia, a lower-speed rally-like version of the original epic Italian motor race. We are less than an hour's drive from the starting city, Brescia. Since only a few hundred will be able to drive in this year's event, this presentation has been prepared to share what was a truly extraordinary experience for everyone who participated. It seeks to chronicle the 1984 Mille Miglia from the perspective of the participants, and accordingly to share with others the magnificence of the event itself, beauty and historic character of Italy, and most importantly, the phenomenal from-the-heart enthusiasm of the Italian people for the Mille Miglia. The Piazza della Vittoria, the traditional site of scrutineering, now used for registration and as such bringing together an incredible collection of more than 200 automobiles. The cars themselves span the 30 years, 1927 to 1957, that the Mille Miglia was run. The history of these former racers was truly extraordinary, with overall and class victories at Le Mans, Sebring, Nürburgring, and of course many Mille Miglias. The pleasure of the occasion was shared by young and old. No marque achieved more success in the Mille Miglia than Alfa Romeo, and was better represented here. These were the cars that had been driven by the greatest drivers, including Moss, Fangio, and Nuvolari. Many were also landmark automotive designs. Now they were basking in the glory of their earlier successes and heritage. This festival-like atmosphere was enhanced by many racing luminaries, including America's first world champion, Phil Hill, who interestingly was driving in his first Mille Miglia. The Contessa Maggi, wife of one of the four original organizers and gracious hostess of the traditional driver's dinner. Huschke von Hunstein, 1940 winner in a BMW, and may be best known as Porsche's longtime director of racing. Sterling Moss, whose 1955 win has been judged by many to be his greatest drive. Together with his navigator Dennis Jenkinson, he averaged 98.5 miles per hour. Reflecting the commitment of all the Americans who participated, Bob Sutherland brought his 1927 Bugatti more than 5,000 miles. Everyone was honored with the presence of the legendary Juan Manuel Fangio, returning to Italy where he had the extraordinary distinction of winning a world championship driving for Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, and Maserati. Ironically, the Mille Miglia was one of the few races he never won, although he finished fourth, third, and twice second. This gathering of great cars and drivers was more than the registration for the 1984 Mille Miglia. It was the beginning of an enormous national festival celebrating the leading role Italy has played in designing, manufacturing, and most importantly, racing of automobiles. Thus, the Mille Miglia is much more than an event. Because it embodies so much of the Italian spirit, the Mille Miglia is a deep-seated part of the national heritage. We, the participants, are proud to be part of this year's event, to share our cars with the people of Italy, and together with them, to write another chapter in this 57-year saga. This year's three-day route first takes us at night east to Ferrara. On day 2, it's south along the Adriatic, and then west through the mountains to Rome. The final leg is north to Florence and back to Brescia. The start was incredible. All around us were hundreds of photographers and the enormous crowd. Even though there had been heavy rain earlier, it seemed like all of the city was there, jubilant to relive a major part of Brescia's heritage and Italy's pride. Adhering to the Mille Miglia tradition, each participant left one at a time at a predefined time. The focus of attention was the floodlit starting ramp, which each competitor drove up, just like the old days. In contrast to these vintage scenes from 1957, the fact that we were starting at night made it very, very difficult to photograph. Our pictures of the 1984 Mille Miglia start are the only ones known to have been taken from a racer. They reflect not only the photographic difficulty of the situation, but most importantly, the joy and enthusiasm of the phenomenal crowds. There were two cars from which we took pictures. This 1957 Porsche 550 Spyder, which had won the Index of Performance at Sebring, now driven by its owner, Warren Eads and Mark Pettibone, and my Cunningham C4R, which had won Sebring and finished third overall and first in its class at Le Mans. My Mille Miglia co-driver was Augie Paps. His memories of the incredible start.
The start of the race I'll never forget. Going through a crowd of, it wasn't a crowd, it was a sea of people. And you would see maybe 3-foot path in front of you, and somehow it opened up. And these people love to touch the drivers and the co-driver. And they're throwing flowers in, and they're reaching out to touch you. It reminds me of, what is it, Running with the Bulls in Pamplona?
There were 221 starters. The last car to leave Brescia was a 2-liter Ferrari driven by Barbara Fergus.
We left Brescia after you all were probably in Verona. Unfortunately, Patrice, one of the national heroes of driving, was in front of us, and there wasn't one hand that he didn't touch as he went out of town, which means that even though the 550 doesn't overheat, we overheated getting out of town. It took us 30 minutes just to get to the outskirts of town. He had his arms in the air this way. And then when he got to the outskirts of town, he turned in and went into a bar. And off we went. And it took us until Verona, driving high speed to catch up to the last guy.
After having arrived in Ferrara well after midnight, it was only a few hours of sleep for the participants before it was time for them to prepare their cars for the long day's drive ahead. All of the racers had been neatly parked together in this square. It was an extraordinary sight. The combination of the old buildings, the multitude of great cars, and the large crowds of enthusiastic onlookers. The cars left Ferrara, one at a time, at preset intervals. Today's route will take us south to Rimini, along the Adriatic coast, and then west through the mountains to Rome, approximately 400 miles. One of the special qualities of Italy is the pervading sense of history and art, which we encountered in many beautiful arches. As we headed south towards the Adriatic and to D Jaguar passes, it was wonderful to relive, although not at racing speeds, the exact same roads of the legendary race. Belgian motor racing journalist Jacques Ickx once described the original Mille Miglia as a whole lifetime in 12 hours. It was, he said, the quintessence of an adventure as full as that of Marco Polo or Magellan. It is also a contribution to man's conquest of the impossible. Having been born in Italy, seen one of the original Mille Miglias, and now as a leading organizer of vintage motorsports in America, I asked Joe Marchetti, what is the Mille Miglia?
I have to answer what the Mille Miglia is today. The Mille Miglia today is a rebirth of an historic event which you're trying to relive a great racing period in the history of the world, to bring back the glory, the fun, the sportsmanship, and and leaving out the dangerous part. So it is a race, but it's also a rally. But more so than anything, it's a happening. It's a happening where everybody can enjoy, join in.
It was 4 citizens of Brescia who conceived the original idea of a long-distance through-the-streets race. They chose the Brescia-Rome-Brescia route when they realized that it covered exactly 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles, and accordingly the event could take the fitting and harmonious name Mille Miglia. Their idea evolved, in the words of Giovanni Laurani, author of the definitive book on the Mille Miglia, into the most dramatic race motorsport has ever known. On the ordinary roads which linked village to village, passing through towns, crossing rivers and mountains, hundreds of cars raced on with the aim of accomplishing at the highest speed in the shortest time a round tour of Italy. In 1957, the lead Ferrari averaged over 126 miles an hour down this street and through this famous arch. In the movie The Racer, the arch was brushed, Hollywood style, with John Fitch driving for actor Kirk Douglas. For the record, the Mille Miglia was run 24 times during the 30 years 1927-1957. It was known as the race of 14,000 corners. There were 12 different Mille Miglia courses. In the latter years, the faster cars completed the course in 10 to 13 hours, the slower cars in 18 to 20 hours. The fewest number of competitors were 57 in 1934, the largest number 521 in 1955. In the whole of the series of the Mille Miglia, it is estimated that 100 million spectators watched some 5,300 racers compete. Only 3 times did non-Italian cars win. All of the cars participating in this year's Mille Miglia had a racing history or heritage. Their ages covered the 4 decades in which the original event was run. For the many which had raced in the Mille Miglia, this year's event was a well-deserved encore. Commenting on the cordial hospitality, Bob Fergus.
It was just the enthusiasm of the crowd was just overwhelming. I couldn't believe there'd be that many people that would give up their Sunday activities to stand on a street corner and watch 221 race cars go by. I was just amazed every time we'd see crowds, and as you remember, every village, the streets were just lined with people, and they all were smiling, and I thought our cockpit was going to fill up to the door jams with gifts and goodies that they gave us, candy, as you know, and flowers, and wine, and all kinds of trinkets and things. It was the excitement of seeing the people having such a good time, and I think that made you have, you know, we all had a good time. It was just 1,000 miles of waving and smiling at people.
Bill Jacobs describes how one of the gifts was put into immediate, unforeseen, and very good use.
Richard Hinson, who went with me as a passenger, soon found out that the passenger side of the Mondale I was driving didn't have a windscreen, and was quite relieved when we stopped at a little town and they handed out a plate that you would eat off of and use that as a windscreen, holding it up. And we got a lot of comments about that for a long time, and still are getting them.
Interspersed throughout the course were many control points to ensure that the contestants followed the prescribed route. These were usually located in major cities and attracted large crowds. A commemorative plate was one of many mementos given to the participants at these stops. Every aspect of the 1984 Mille Miglia reflected thorough planning and excellent organization. This was exemplified by the organizers' publication of a 188-page hardbound yearbook containing hundreds of color pictures. Another example were the gifts which awaited every entrant at the registration in Brescia. They included 2 specially manufactured traditional crash helmets of the polo type made famous by Sterling Moss, a multifunction stopwatch, silk tie, and 2 bottles of champagne, all of which were distinctively labeled with the famous Mille Miglia logo. How refreshing it was to begin the 3rd day with great weather, for the drive the night before to Rome had been grueling, in steady rain with intermittent fog. Driving a Renault this year in marked contrast to his Ferrari in 1957 was Piero Truffi, contestant in 13 events and winner of the last Mille Miglia race. The route for this, the last day, was north to Florence, Bologna, Modena, and finally Brescia. No marque was better represented than Alfa Romeo, and as it should be, for no marque played a larger role in the history of the Mille Miglia. During the 1930s, it truly dominated the event. In total, Alfa Romeo won overall 11 of the 24 events, and placed in the top 10 97 times. In addition, it achieved 37 class victories and placed first, second, or third in class in every Mille Miglia. Covering the vintage Mille Miglia for the second time, and therefore uniquely able to compare the two, Road and Track's John Lamb.
First year was absolutely charming because it was the first time they'd done it. And afterward, Martin and I were just completely in love with it. Came back and told everybody we knew about it and wondered how they could ever make it any better. Well, they did it by making it that much bigger and that much friendlier and that much more fun. And without, as oftentimes happens, losing the personal, wonderful, neat little touches that went with the first one. So many times when people shoot for bigger and better, they lose that initial warmth and that sort of spontaneity and simpatico that just flowed the first time. Well, they had it the second time, only it was times 20. And it's going to be interesting next year to see if they can, and I suspect they can, make it even that much bigger and that much better. Because I think it's part of just the national Italian attitude. If you were to sit down and say, all right, we're going to make up a plan whereby the next one will be just as interesting and warm and just as much fun, you'd probably fail. But when it comes from the heart, the way this thing does, it's going to work. I would put money on it right now. I'm not a betting man.
Most of the Mille Miglia cars were painted in the traditional international racing colors of their country of origin. French blue for the Bugattis and Delahaye's, silver for the German Porsches, Mercedes, and BMWs, white with blue stripes for the American Cunningham, British green for the Jaguars, Bentleys, and Fraser-Nashes, and Italian red for Ferraris, Maseratis, Alfa Romeos, and Stanguilinis. Fantasy Island, the popular television show where dreams come true. That's what the Mille Miglia experience was to Bob Bodine.
Italy is the only place in the world that could happen. And it is one of one of the Fantasy Island episodes, I'm sure. I'm not for questioning that at all. It's just fabulous. The Fantasy Island for car buffs. No matter what you were driving, everybody felt like it was their show. I just can't say enough about that. Everybody I met, whether they were driving a 1-liter Douche Bonnet or a 9-liter Maserati, was just having a ball.
In the true spirit of the event, and amazingly without any troubles, this Danish-owned 1927 Bugatti was driven to Italy, ran the entire Mille Miglia, and then completed its 3,000-mile automotive odyssey back to Denmark. For all who participated in the 1984 Mille Miglia, it was more than an exciting tour of 1,000 miles. It was also a montage of 1,000,000 memories, recalling one of his, Bob Fergus.
I'll never forget, I guess it was on Sunday after we left Rome. We were coming out of one more small village with all the people in the village very enthusiastic and waving. We turned this corner, and there was a priest with 2 nuns, and there must have been 25 little girls out of school. And when they saw our car, and they just started jumping up and down, you thought it was a Toyota ad or something, and we're just leaping off the ground. Both the sisters and the father, everybody leaping off the ground with the rosaries flying in the air, and everybody waving and smiling. And I took both hands up and just went like that to them. But if we waved at one person, we must have waved at 1,000,000.
As this beautiful 2-liter A6 GCS Maserati passes us, it's appropriate to reflect upon its role in the original Mille Miglia. Class champion 3 years in a row, 1954, 1955, and 1956. Sterling Moss raced a 4.5-liter Maserati like this one in the 1957 Mille Miglia, unfortunately retiring after only 12 kilometers. This year Moss was also driving a Maserati and fared only slightly better. Barbara Fergus describes.
He was driving with a German. He said, I speak Italian, I speak French, I speak English. I don't speak German. The damn car isn't working right, and I can't tell the guy. He was all over the road. I said to Robert, do you think Sterling feels all right? The car was weaving back and forth. He said, look at this steering wheel. And he was jiggling it like that. He said, I can't keep the darn thing on the road. And then if you remember, he was in Rome, and the next thing I saw, they were trailering his car to the finish line, and he went across the finish line. So I think Sterling did 1/2 of the race.
You may have wondered about this bulge on my Cunningham. It's the oil cooler, reportedly straight out of an airplane. My co-driver Augie Paps reflecting about some of his most vivid memories.
The things that flash through my mind are the wonderful times through the mountains and the lovely scenery, the breathtaking scenery that you really didn't have enough time to enjoy. But sometimes driving through the mountains, obviously you can't take the time to look because the minute you do, you're off the road. But we were going so bloody fast. And I remember one time when, Bob, you were driving with me, and you were trying, I think, to take some photographs, or rather some videotape. And I don't know how that possibly could have turned out, because we were going so fast and your camera was swinging around and I could hear you suck in your breath, go and of course some of these crazy people in their Ferraris and Maseratis were going so fast. And the guys in the D-type Jaguars that were driving like bloody maniacs. And one time that we decided that we'd had enough of this D-type Jaguar stuff, and we just wanted to show them that the Cunningham still had something with it, and it sure did. We kept them behind us.
Here our second camera car was obviously running flawlessly. The finish, however, was another story. Describing it, Warren Eads.
After 999 miles of rather flawless high-performance running by our little 57 Porsche Spyder, and with just about 300 yards to go, I noticed a gas smell, and the crowd started yelling, "Gasolina, gasolina!" And with that, the engine died. Mark and I looked back over our shoulders, and we saw the problem was a long trail of gas coming out of the back of the car. So just about this time, we were looking at each other with considerable disgust, and the officials started pushing us off the course, so things looked pretty grim. I jumped out and found the fuel line pulled off the firewall, so we were able to get the engine started again, and the crowd cheered and yelled for us, and we got back into the line, but all still wasn't well because the car sputtered and jerked down to the finish line. And it really is amazing what happened, because after a careful look post-race, to our amazement, all of the frame tubing as they enter the back of the joined to the back of the car had broken loose and cracked, and this left the rear transmission mount free to drop down onto the belly pans, and that rocked the engine back and pulled the fuel lines off the firewall. So there was no way the car was going to go another foot. I'm sure glad the originators of the Mille Miglia decided on exactly 1,000 miles.
One of the most interesting Ferraris was a 250 GT, which had finished a remarkable third in the 57 Mille Miglia, only 8 minutes behind the winner, Taruffi. Note, with that same time in the record-setting 55 event, the car would have been second to Moss and nearly 4 minutes ahead of Fangio's Mercedes 300 SLR. This year, the car and its illustrious 1957 driver were reunited. Recounting the event, car owner Bob Bodine.
We met the original driver of our car, Oliver Jean de Bihan, who was running for the factory at that time. It was really an exciting thing. I recognized him and said hello to him and found him. And we talked about the car, and he told us of all the experiences he had with it, some very enlightening, fun experiences for us who only know of these people from books. And throughout the rest of the trip, Mr. Jean de Bihan was showing up next to our car and telling us about this and that experience that he had when he won the GT class in 57 with the car. Certain things that he said were actually applicable 20-some years later. The roads, he says, watch this section, it's very rough, on infinitum. It was really, really an experience.
Again, Road and Track's John Lamb, who was traveling with renowned European journalist Ian Young.
We stopped in a small town, And Ian Young and I both happened to be addicted to ice cream. And, of course, Italian ice cream is really special. And I said, quick, Ian, stop over there. They've got ice cream. So he came to a screeching halt. I jumped out, ran up and said, Cioccolato, due. And they gave me 2 ice cream cones with 2 great big scoops of chocolate. And I reached in my pocket, and the guy put his hand on my hand and said, no, Mille Miglia, and sent us on our way with free ice cream. This sort of thing just happened all along the way. And that's the kind of spontaneity and simpatico that just, you could never plan for. It just has to happen, and it does there. It's Italy, you know. That's the fun.
With another really unique story, Bill Pryor.
We met a funeral. Now, where I live, traffic always pulls over and lets a funeral go by. It's just something you do out of respect. But this funeral stopped for us. They were coming toward us, and they all pulled over to the side of the road, and they rolled down their windows and they waved to us. And I was quite flabbergasted by that one.
America's first world champion, Phil Hill.
Well, Florence, of course, was just spectacular. But, of course, I've been to Florence so many times that...
but never like this.
Never like that, no. Oh, that was just sensational.
Mechanical problems had sidelined their original racer, but Florence was very special to Joe Marchetti and his co-driver. They were determined to drive through the Great Square, even if they had to borrow a car to do it. Joe relives that poignant moment.
My co-pilot was from Florence, and he was a gentleman like myself who had dreamed about racing, but never did any professional racing. So to him, this was a wonderful experience. And of course, we had to borrow a car to go through Florence, and his entire family was waiting for us when we arrived in Florence. And I remember his mother, and I remember she was crying, and she had a glass of wine for him, and she had a glass of wine for me, and she looked at him, and tears were on her cheeks, and she said to him in Italian, "Finally, you've lived your dream."
The spirit of the Mille Miglia, as reflected in the drivers. Phil Hill comments on the enthusiasm of the Italian people.
I've never seen people with that kind of spirit, really, to tell you the truth. It was bigger than life. Really, I don't know what they thought they were experiencing, but it was almost as if it was more than the original Mille Miglia even. And you found old people that had been middle-aged perhaps, or a little less, when the real races were going on, that were remembering it as if it were better than it was, and it was really just a shadow of the original event as far as the sporting event is concerned. And then the younger ones just, it was really just marvelous to see their reactions.
Bill Jacobs' most vivid memory.
The most incredible thing was that literally for 1,000 miles of the race course, I don't think that there was 100 miles that the streets weren't lined with people out in the middle of the country. Mostly, I remember 50, 60-year-old ladies holding handkerchiefs, waving them as you came by, and just jumping up and down. And of course, there was whole schools of kids out, and they were all in their uniforms, and they're all cheering. And it could have been in the middle of the night and rain, and there was people lined up.
One small town everyone vividly remembered. Toliara Tunov tells us why.
We were stopped in a little town and forced to drink scotch by the mayor. One of the cars behind us declined the scotch, at which point the mayor drank it himself, I was told. After we drank our scotch, the mayor said in beautifully accented English, now you will drive much faster, yes, and waved us on. Now, I'd like to contrast that with just about any city in the United States.
The hospitality of Loiano also extended to our second camera car. Pause to refresh was also part of the original Mille Miglia. These pictures of yesteryear bring back one of my most vivid memories of this year's event, talking with Sterling Moss about his epic victory and his recounting of the final very fast leg to Brescia. He was passing the earliest starters, the tiny front door Isettas. The speed differential was more than 100 miles an hour. With a chuckle of pleasure, he spoke of looking in his rearview mirror and watching the Isetta drivers fight to control their small cars from the wind buffeting created by his speeding Mercedes. As the participants in the 1984 Mille Miglia pressed northward over the legendary Futa and Ratacusa passes, part of all but two of the original Mille Miglia courses, it was extraordinary to reflect upon the great drivers who had preceded us and traveled this very road: Caracciola, Varzi, Villoresi, Maggi, Dreyfus, Campari, Marzotto, Ascari, Chiron, Farina, Collins, Kling, Castellotti, Berra, Taruffi, Jean Duby, Musso, and Von Trips, as well as the legendary Sterling Moss, Juan Manuel Fangio, and Tazio Nuvolari. Several of us felt like we were reliving Nuvolari's epic 1930 drive when he drove the final night part of that race with his headlights turned off until the finish, thereby, unknown to his long-standing rival Varzi, catching up and winning the race. In 1984, 3 of the American entries also had exciting night drives to the finish. Recounting the first, Augie Paps.
That last day, after we left Modena, and the generator started to act up, at least that's what I thought it was, and I think it was the voltage regulator. If I just had enough brains to get out and give it a swift kick, I think it'd been okay. And the damn headlights, we had to turn off because we knew that we were going to drain the battery, and we would have actually. And finally picked up a police escort. And Jesus, we're going like bloody hell down the road with no lights and hoping that nobody's going to pull out on us.
Recounting his adventure, Phil Hill.
Big pain in the neck to not have any lights on that car.
Oh, you had no driving
No,
lights?
we just driving stroboscopically the whole time, just going on with little blinks. And each time the lights flash on, you get to see what you're going to come upon the next 10 seconds, you know. And that was nerve-wracking.
And then there was Bill Jacobs with a different but equally serious problem.
We got about a half an hour away from the finish line, and I had a major brake problem. We stopped, and I thought I was done for. It was getting late, and finally, after about 2 hours, we just totally disconnected the front right brake. When we had taken the wheel off, the shoe just fell right out onto the ground, and therefore I had to basically no brakes, one little bit of a brake, and every time I pushed on the brakes, our whole car would jump 300 feet to one side. But we caught up with the ending few, and we started late anyway, and went right over the finish line right with everyone else, and it was sure an experience.
Everyone had some amazing driving experiences. Recounting one of his, Toli Aratunov.
I don't believe that Gene Hackman and the French Connection had half as much fun as we did going through one of the major cities in Italy, which I can't recall the name of right now. He had everything blocked off and laid out. All we had was the enthusiasm or fanaticism of a red Alfa belonging to the president of the French Alfa Club, which was mentioned in several publications as being one of the wilder drivers. But with the police help and with our little momentum of the majority of the people on the road, at least the majority driving fast on the wrong side of the road, we were up on sidewalks, we were waved through red lights at something approaching 60 miles an hour by the policemen, one of whom leaned over and wrapped a motorcyclist on a helmet who was trying to take advantage of his green light to go across our path. And shortly after that, while I was remarking on that to Bill and also waving at people in the crowd and still blasting down the wrong side of the road, I looked up to realize a little old lady in a kind of a blue-gray Fiat that matched the pavement was coming at me head-on. She was planning on making a left turn, and I was over in her lane, and by the time her eyes got about as big as the headlights on her Fiat, I decided that I would have to pretend like I knew she was there all along. So as I passed her on the wrong side, putting me 2 lanes to the left of the yellow line, I casually waved and smiled at her and thought, I guess Sterling Moss would have done something like that.
The next stop was Modena, home of the Ferrari factory. Reflecting on his return to the mark for which he won the 1961 World Driving Championship, Phil Hill.
Well, we were one of the first there, and I had a little chat with Commendatore Ferrari before we moved up to the front where he was when everyone departed to go into the center of the town. And it was a lot of fun talking to Florini and a number of the people that were there when I was there. And it was just a great experience. And of course, I can't tell you what I felt about it when we moved on into the center of the, where the Ghirlandina and the church and everything are in the center. That was just fabulous.
One of the special pleasures of the Mille Miglia was the racing cars, of unique character, design, and identity. These cars were such a refreshing contrast with today's racers, billboards shaped in the form of homogeneous aerodynamic wedges. Now, Having returned to Brescia and completed the Mille Miglia, it was time for the participants to reflect on their many memories. Here we briefly relive those 1,000 miles with Phil Hill and Murray Smith in Murray's 4.5-liter Bentley. However great our memories of the participating cars were, and they were wonderful, they were nevertheless overshadowed by the people with whom we shared our cars. Although we have all tried, words seem truly inadequate to describe their enthusiasm and the depth of the feeling of the Italian people for the Mille Miglia. Road and Track's John Lamb maybe best reflected the sentiments of the American participants when he reported, "In the end, it was the people who watched the Mille Miglia who made the event so special. The crowds at scrutineering and the start, the children lining the fences in front of their schools, waving their handkerchiefs, the old men with well-worn faces sitting at roadside cafes, waving their caps, the workers laying down their shovels, trowels, rakes, or whatever, to pause, smile, and wave, the grandfathers pointing out cars to grandsons while explaining with words and gestures about the great Mille Miglia years, a man sitting alone by the road that climbs through the mountains, checking off the cars as they pass, the crowds waving at midnight under the orange glow of the few street lights in their small village, waiting for the cars, and the man from Brescia who had witnessed the start and finish of almost every Mille Miglia, as he said with misty eyes, "You must understand, this event was part of us, part of our lives." The next day, in a pouring rain, all of the Mille Miglia participants gathered at the great castle of Brescia for a lavish awards and farewell banquet. It was a time of joyous reflection about all that had been experienced. It was also a time to sorrowfully realize that the incredible adventure was now over, at least for 1984. As all of the guests admired the enormous cake detailing the 1,000-mile route, there was a strong desire that the success of this year's event be continued, that in 2 years there be another vintage Mille Miglia. For the Americans who participated in this year's event, there developed a commitment to return and be part of the continuing great Mille Miglia saga.
I can't wait till the next one. I'm already looking forward to it. If anybody has any work for me during those days in May, forget it.